Hola, yo soy Wave.
Small grain specialist for the state of Virginia. My program focuses on profitable grain-based systems here in the Mid-Atlantic region. And one of those focus areas is on the improvement of soil health and soil quality for maximum economic benefit for our growers. Today, I want to talk to you about a project that we've been working on for several years as I share my screen and give you a title of Targeted Soil Health Improvements for Improved Conservation and Economic Outcomes. It's an example of the scenario that we face in Virginia. Let's say we have an 8.8 megagram per hectare yield potential for a field, and we're selling this corn for $150 per megagram. Look through the variable and total costs, and what you find at the end of the year is that the return to land management and risk is $107 per hectare. Not great, but profitable. But if we change that scenario, we'd have the same selling price, but we reduce the yield to 6.2 megagrams per hectare. You very quickly see that the total costs are greater than our gross income. And so we lose $150 per hectare, which is a detrimental thing for our farm community. The thing that we've come to understand, of course, is that yield distribution is not the same across an entire field. And this map represents a good example of that, where when you look, there are portions of the field where we have extremely high yields in the center in these areas. Edges are poor yielding areas, and there are also some landforms or other issues associated with portions of this field where yields are lower. So it's important for us to not only understand the total field average yield, but also the location of the spatial location of those yields so that we can think about managing that. Because when I talk to farmers about this, I explain to them that, you know, they know every hill, every low spot, every eroded and sandy spot in every field they farm. But what they may not be doing, what they may not know is how that translates into a variation in yield. And they certainly may not be doing anything with that knowledge. How are they improving their farming operation to become more profitable with that information? So what we've talked about is an example of a field where we've conducted research for several years, 17 hectares. The average yield in this particular year was 9.9 megagrams. Using the example prices that we used before, this field produced a profit of $133 per hectare. Very acceptable. But we have a problem in that one portion of that field is significantly lower yielding than the rest of the field. And so while the portions there that are represented by the soil series that are marked in white have a positive yield contribution, economic contribution, the area in blue actually has a detriment on the economics of the entire field. That area loses money. So if we just simply remove that from our calculations from our scenario, now we have a 14 hectare field. The average yield goes up to 11 megagrams, and the average income becomes $230 per hectare. So we've made money by saving money in that particular case and not putting it in an area where we knew we had low yield potential. So for the sake of discussion that we're using for this talk, we're going to put these into three categories for discussion. So we have those areas of the field that have high profit potential, consistently high yields, and would probably benefit from increased inputs. Then we have these areas that are marginal. They're inconsistent or at risk. They might make money when commodity prices are high. When commodity prices are low, they barely break even or might even lose a little money. So these are areas where we might focus to reduce input costs and try to improve the bottom line. Then we have those areas that are consistently unprofitable. Year after year after year, when you look at those pigments or those pixels on a yield map, you see that they are not producing a return. So for these areas, we need to consider alternative management strategies and a redistribution of inputs away from these areas and to those high profit acres. So how do we get this information? Well, year on year, we get it with yield maps over time. We also can use some in-season and past season aerial imagery. And some soil maps, and in our case in the U.S., especially in Virginia, we have realistic yields associated with those based on a number of years of research data collected there. So we know what to expect from these soils. We also need to consider the surroundings. In Virginia, we farm a number of small, irregularly shaped fields, as you can see in the photos on the slide. And many of them have these hardwood tree borders that produce these shadows, as you can see on the edge of the fields. They also are havens for wildlife and other pests. So you add that to the fact that these areas are, this is where turning is occurring and potential over and under application. And you know, the edges of our field tend to be poor performers, and that is the case for lots of reasons, but we have to take into account the surroundings that are associated with that. And we look for consistency in-season image rank in NDVI. You can see this red area of the field beginning to show some stress before the rest of the field, along with some poor performance along the edges here, probably due to compaction. But this is something that if that's consistent from year to year, we need to think about managing those spots in the field differently. We can also use a soil series based model if we have good enough maps to work with. However, we've run into some issues with that. The soil maps that we have were never intended to be used for small scale spatial variability and management. So what you have is a situation where the aerial imagery of a small field is shown on the left. You can see the soybean residue at the end of the season is much paler on the left-hand side as it is on the right. It sort of matches up with the way the soil series are mapped on the figure on the right, but not exactly. But when you look at that imagery overlaid with the yield points of those soybeans, you find very quickly that what is written for the soil map is much better reflected in the yield map than what was on paper on the right-hand side. So those have to be used with some caution. They can be a strong contributor, but they're also not always as accurate as we need to be for this small scale management. Now, when we do, sort of our gold standard, when we do have multiple years of yield monitor data on fields, we can really learn a lot. As an example, you see this field where we have corn yields from 2011 and 2013. You can see consistently the middle part of the field is the highest yielding areas. Edges are poor. There's also an area in here, and perhaps a larger area along this entire side where corn yields are on the lower end. And the way we've designated these is the red dots are less than 80% of the field average. The green dots are 120, and those in yellow are 80 to 120, so medium. So you see those areas where we have really good performance and less good performance. Soybeans tell their own story, but they don't always, for us at least, line up to be the same high and low yielding areas. I think that has to do with the fact that our stressful period for temperature and water for corn is probably a month earlier than it is for soybeans. And so we have just a different set of constraints associated with the difference in the seasonality. There are some consistencies though. If you look around the edge of the field, you look at this area where we saw poor performance in corn, you tend to pick it out in soybeans too, although it is less clear cut with soybeans than it is with corn year on year. Breaking it out a little bit, if you just pull out those over both corn and soybeans where we had portions of the field that was less than 80% of the field average. Again, you're going to find these edges. You're going to find this area, as we talked about there and right here. These are the green ones that are greater than 120%. So this is the area that we would tend to focus on for improvement and potentially higher inputs. These areas in red, though, are areas where we either need to think about reducing inputs and becoming more profitable managers, or in some cases, if they haven't been profitable in 4 years, we need to think about doing something else entirely. Another example on a very small scale, this field was just a few hectares, average 12.9 megagrams, but 1/7 of 1 hectare of that field by itself loses $180. So just taking out that less than 1 hectare area on this highly sloping area that had poor performance could increase per hectare income on that field by $13. So it's a matter of being very cognizant about those areas that are contributing positively and negatively. So when we talk about this issue, we have to, deal with the answer that All of these are site specific. So you have these headlands and wood edges that might be compacted, where we may want to reduce inputs because of compaction and overlap and under fertilization and all these other things. We might also consider expanding field edges for buffers and wildlife plantings in Virginia to try to move those crops further away from those trees and other levels of damage. In those areas that are moderate yield or at risk, we really need to identify the cause. Is it physical, chemical, or other? Can we reduce inputs? Can we reduce the seeding rate in corn or increase it in soybeans? Can we change cultivars to be more defensive? And then can we also maybe perhaps target some areas for soil quality improvement? And then finally, we have these consistently unprofitable areas. For years and years, if you look back over multiple years of yield maps, you find that they're always less than 80%. They're always negative. So what do we do with that? Well, we proposed a strategy to use these, to set aside these areas. So we wanted to locate these consistently poor performing areas of these fields, understand the cause, and when it was poor soil health or low water holding capacity, we wanted to demonstrate the ability of an intensive cover cropping system to try to remediate and improve that soil health in a short and medium term. And then we follow this as soil health, nutrient use efficiency, and crop yield as we move through this process. So let me talk a little bit about what we did. We went through the yield maps, as I said, and identified those areas that are poor performers. Then we studied them to understand why. And as an example, we looked at a number of physical and chemical parameters. This is just one where we looked at penetration resistance or bulk density. As we move across these 4 fields that we're studying, you can see some variation there in them, but this is just the initial sample. So this was our baseline. We're also assessing using the Cornell University Assessment of Soil Health, the CASH assessment, where we look at available water holding capacity, aggregate stability, organic matter, soil protein, soil respiration levels, active carbon, and then some chemical parameters as well. Each one of those is scored independently, and then you give an overall quality score of medium. So this was our baseline data for one of our fields. So we have physical, chemical, and biological assessments of where we started before we began our cover cropping system. Then we took an area that was demonstrated by the photo on the right, and this is just one of the 4 fields. But you can see that we assigned one of 3 treatments because the 4th treatment, that's perennials, is excluded from this analysis. We started with a winter cover crop. For us, that would be fall, so October of 2017 into spring of 2018, say April, in Virginia, with a cover crop mix of rye, rapeseed, and vetch. Then in the summer, treatment 1 was immediately returned to cash crop. So it was in this field was in corn in 2017. Then we followed with a winter cover crop and planted immediately after that. And then we fell right back into a rotation with soybeans the following summer. Treatment 2 got a summer rotation of sun hemp and sunflowers, then winter cover crops, and then back to cash crop corn for treatments 1 and 2 by summer of 19. Treatment 3 had winter cover, summer cover, winter cover, summer cover, winter cover, and then is back to cash soybeans for summer of 2020. So we took one of these treatments out every year and continued to intensively cover crop each of the others. Some of the things we found that were problems at these sites were initial soil compaction, like you see on the left. We also found some levels with ponded water levels within it, perched water, through these oxidized rhizospheres. So we had some infiltration problems as well as some compaction problems. We used rye, vetch, and crimson clover in these in various mixtures and sundries. We didn't prescribe these to the farmers. The idea of this was not a controlled experiment. This was, we asked them to incorporate what they could work with on their farms. And so we have some variation. What we intended to do, though, was grow a very representative set of winter cover crops that would represent what would be grown in the region, mostly in mixtures. So you would have the rye and the vetch, or the rye and the crimson clover, or something like that. Sometimes all three in some of these fields. Just some representative field shots of what these crops would have looked like at the time of cover crop termination. So this would just be just prior to spring crop planting, so corn or soybean planting. Then again, for treatment one, after one winter cover crop season, and that's all, it returned back into the corn and soybean rotation. In this case, it was soybeans. For the other treatments, here's an example of what it looked like in summer 2018 with sunflower, pearl millet, sorghum Sudan grass, cowpeas, and radishes all planted out there. You can see a full-size Ford pickup here on the right-hand side for a reference to the height. And then here's the path where we were beginning to do the termination and knock the cover crops down. So significant amount of growth in the summertime compared to the wintertime. Again, here's an example of the height with a meter stick there and then a pair of post hole diggers to give you an idea of the height. In this particular year, in this field, we had dry biomass readings from about 11 to 14 megagrams per hectare. So an enormous amount of biomass returned to the system. And that created some interesting situations for us as we dealt with that. This is October of 18. As we terminate that and begin to plant winter cover crops. Here's a video of one of the cooperating farmers using a vertical tillage tool to knock down his cover crop, and the disappearance of his John Deere tractor for a few seconds. So we saw some interesting things after that first year of summer crops. In fact, this is actually after winter cover crop, summer cover crop, and another winter cover crop before coming into the summer. I mentioned we had the 4 farms. Farm 1, remember, had very little compaction, and so not much change in there. But the other 3 all had what I would consider to be significantly restricted layers. Well, this graph represents the change in penetration resistance in that top 15 centimeters. And you can see that each one of these represents 3 replications on that farm, but they all reduced quite significantly just after 3 seasons of cover cropping. And so in some respects, at least on the soil physical side, we feel like we're moving in the right direction in terms of making some positive changes in these fields. We created some difficulties for us. If you can imagine knocking over all that summer cover crop biomass, we had some difficulty seeding into that for our winter cover crops. We had some stand establishment issues. Throughout this study, our winter cover crops have yielded between 1 and 4 megagrams of total dry biomass in the spring at the end of the termination season. But after the crop that was planted in 2018/19, the fall of 18, after those massive summer cover crops, did create some seeding issues that we had to deal with. By the second year, we had a better handle on that. In fact, we used that vertical tillage tool to size and redistribute the residue, and so we were able to get much better seed soil contact. So this is one of those areas where we were learning as we went. So in the first year of the system, where we just had one cover crop and then right back to soybeans, we had no change, no effect on, nothing positive in terms of soybean yields. After we'd had been through 2 rotations, so now we're back into corn. This treatment had been in winter cover, summer cover, and winter cover, and then returned to corn. We saw an increase of 0.8 megagrams per hectare with a range from 0.1 to 1.4 across the farms and fields. And again, we saw no change in soybean yield. I'm sorry, that should say 2018. Then the treatment 3 was planted to an additional round of summer and winter cover crops in 2019 and 20. So you see the winter cover there on the left, the cool season cover crops, and then warm season cover crops on the right-hand side. And that wraps us up. We're in the midst of that season now. And so in September, October, November, we will have collected our final year of yield data on those trials after everything's been returned to crop production, and we'll be able to assess the parameters that we changed, hopefully a positive increase in yield, but also hopefully begin to understand why, whether it's a change in chemical, biological, or physical parameters, or perhaps all, where we'll go back and do our intensive sampling, including a soil health analysis at the end to make that assessment. We're feeling pretty positive about the project, but we'll have some additional data and a paper to share in perhaps another year. I always open us up to questions, but since this will be a virtual presentation, I would invite you at any time to email me at the address listed on the screen, and I'd be happy to join a dialogue or answer any questions that you might have. I want to thank you again, and I appreciate your time today. Hi, I'm Wade Tom. 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 I'm Wade Tom.
Bueno,
Well, thank you, Wade, for your presentation. Personally, I loved it. And there are some questions from the audience for you. The first one is the Cornell University method adapted to other countries?
In general, I would agree that it is, and say yes. It tests an enormous number of factors that could impact soil health. The interpretation of that test will probably be very dependent, but the test itself, so sending samples to that lab and getting the results back, I think would be very applicable, and as applicable in Argentina as it is in the US. But the interpretation, I think, might be very well different there. We'd have to do some validation of the values and the results as it applied to agriculture in other countries.
ujú.
Which were the main changes you found? Which were the main changes you found in terms of soil that might explain this increased yield?
The soils at these sites are sandy loam to loamy sand, so a very, very sandy soils with relatively low water holding capacity. So for us, a relatively modest return of organic matter can very quickly and easily increase soil water holding capacity. I believe that we've also, as we saw with the soil bulk density, we've reduced bulk density and improved soil tilth. So I think we probably had better root exploration as well as increases in soil organic matter.
Ujú. Perfecto.
Okay, and there is another question here for you. Last year, you attended the Aapresid Congress as well, and you were able to visit some farms in Argentina. And I would like to ask you the following, and this is a question from the audience. What are the differences and the similarities that you saw between American farmers and our farmers, and what are the improvement opportunities you may have found that may be applied in Argentina?
Not a simple. One of the main differences is that in our system, typically the landowner is also the person who operates the farm and makes the decisions, also the person who owns the equipment. And so our system is probably more capital intensive in that respect. But from what I did learn, our farmers seem to have better and more ready access to those sorts of that funding in those loans, perhaps than some farmers in Argentina. our farmers as a whole, older. I was surprised to see the number of young people, relatively young people, engaged in farming as farmers, as operators, as consultants throughout. So I was very happy to see that in Argentina, because that's one of the major concerns we have is the aging of our farmer population. It's not cool in many places to be a farmer or an agricultural producer. The systems, in terms of the equipment used, I think Argentina is well ahead of us compared to most of the no-till seeders and equipment that are built there. We have machines that work, but I don't feel like that they're as well designed as what your farmers have access to. I wish we would copy some more of that. And then, I guess the last was the attitude. Despite all of the, challenges associated with agriculture, I was really impressed that all the people that I met in Argentina that were associated with farming were very optimistic about it as a career and as a. I was truly impressed to learn that and to see that.
Muchas gracias, Wade. Gracias por.
Thank you, Wade. Thank you for your answers. I'm receiving other questions about your presentation. There is a specific question here about the method. Which method did you use to assess compaction in the assays you showed?
We used a simple penetrometer, a digital penetrometer that with just a needle on the end.
Bárbaro.
Great. Thank you, Wade. And there is another question here. Is it common for farmers in your area to use tillage to break compaction? And what are the results you get in case that's the case, or which are the methods you use?
It depends. In fields, on farms where we have the need to spread manure, dairy farms and such, we deal with compaction because of the application of that manure. Same thing with poultry litter. And so those farms are using deep rippers. So they're usually, long shanks, maybe 70 centimeters and 70 centimeters apart, pulled for 30 to 40 centimeters deep to shatter those compacted layers. But in Virginia, about 80% of our acres are no-till or never till. So they would never receive any sort of deep or inversion tillage. When we first adopted no-till, we had to do a significant amount of subsoiling to break compaction. But after 5 or maybe 6 years of that system, most of our farmers were able to park those, except for occasionally they rip end rows or headlands, but it's very rare for us to use deep tillage in the majority of fields anymore because of the long-term no-till systems.
O sea, en los lugares donde aplicaron.
In places where you apply tillage, you had more compaction, and in a land under no-till, you had less compaction. Is that what we can understand?
Yes, not initially. When we initially adopted no-till, we had more problems with compaction. But as the system matured and as the pore structure became more natural and more effective, then the soils themselves became much more resistant to that traffic and to compaction. And so we just don't have the problem anymore in the vast majority of our farms.
Wade, y acá me llega otra.
There's one more question. Did you find any relationship between the soil structure and microbiology or the biodiversity in those soils?
I think it's too early to say. I think we will. I think we will see a change in the bacterial fungal ratios and relationships. I know we'll see increased organic matter overall in these systems. I think we'll probably see a response in maybe some macroinvertebrates and some other larger soil animals based on observations. The only thing we've done so far to categorize that are those Cornell soil health assessment tests, and it takes about 6 months for us to get the samples ready and to get those analyzed. So I just don't have those answers yet, but I do believe that we're going to have some positive impacts on the soil microbiological status and therefore soil health.
Genial.
Great. For the time being, we don't have more questions from the audience, but I would like to emphasize, to insist, to reinforce something that the audience asks, and this is, what are the opportunities for improvement taking into account our own productions in Argentina? What's your opinion? What can we implement in the production environment regarding your special field of action?
I guess the hypothesis behind what we did was that we found some areas that were not economically productive, and we changed the rotation completely to try to improve the soils. And I think there are opportunities for that in fields no matter worldwide. Is that I feel like there is, an opportunity to look at changing our crop rotation or manipulating our crop rotation so that we have more time for cover crops, different cover crops within the system to increase the biodiversity, increase the organic matter, and improve the soil health. And then, hopefully at some point in time, we can, the rotation can be returned to cash crops. But I'm optimistic that this sort of an idea can be applied in lots of systems in a very targeted manner to those areas of the field that really, really need improvement.
Right, and more questions from the audience are coming. In which areas can we promote cooperation between Argentine farmers and American and U.S. farmers?
I think there are lots of opportunities for that. As the question alluded to earlier, I feel like I learned a lot about crop production in Argentina in my short time there, but I'm sure I barely scratched the surface. And so, I think there are opportunities to assess that farm businesses are conducted in the two countries and compare and contrast. I think the equipment is, as I mentioned, is something where we could definitely learn from you and modify tools to do a better job, such as the equipment in Argentina does. I think the educational systems and the information available to farmers is somewhat different between the two countries. And I think, both the way we do it in the US and the way you do it in Argentina, both have some value. And so I also think that, perhaps we can learn from each other on that side and better leverage the information and the technology that goes to farmers.
Bárbaro.
Great. Thank you very much, Wade. To tell the truth, these concepts that you have shared with us are very relevant, very important, because we can have a feedback on what our position is and what are the opportunities for improvement that we have to make progress and to go into more diverse and more sustainable systems. I think that it is really important to have these discussions that help us focus better, as you were just saying, and try to find opportunities to share information between farmers. And this is my personal question. What possibilities do you see to have a better interaction as you work in the educational sector? Would there be any possible exchange between education in Argentina and education in US regarding these topics we are discussing right now?
I certainly think so, and I hope we can. One of the things that when I left last year, one of the things that I was very much looking forward to was continuing to develop and expand our relationship initially with Virginia Tech and Aapresid, but hopefully with other areas as well. I'd like to see us, some U.S. farmers, come visit. I'd like to see some Argentine farmers come to Virginia, and I would also like to see the same thing with some of the scientists and the educators for an exchange on that side as well. The financing is the challenge, but if we decide to do it, I believe.
Sí.
I agree with you, Wade. I think it's a great idea and we should do it. I think we should carry out these exchanges because they are rich both for us and for you. Well, thank you very much for participating in our Aapresid Congress. It's been an honor for us to have you here. Thank you again. And if you have any closing words, you're welcome to do so.
I want to reciprocate and say thank you so much for the invitation to address the group and to talk about what some of the things that we're doing here in Virginia, and also for the opportunity to hopefully continue to grow and expand the partnership between us and our Aapresid organization and farmers.
Thank you. Undoubtedly, I'm confident that we will keep building partnerships because we're really interested in doing so. Thank you very much again.
Le agradecemos a Wade Thomason y a toda la
Thank you, Wade Thomason, and thank you, everyone. And we will meet again for our next.